difficulties.
I hear that. I'm technically incompetent, so or technologically incompetent, I should say. So I can't be of too much help.
Okay, we are now on YouTube live stream.
Oh, cool.
All right, and I know Andrew, who set this whole thing up, was wanting to be part of this as well. So I gave him the link, and he's not here yet. Okay, I sent him the link, and he's saying, "Okay, do you want me to send that to him?" I'm saying, "No, that's for you, for you to join." Do you know Andrew, Dave?
No, I just he messaged me on Facebook to chat a little bit about some of the previous interactions I've had, all of which were quite comical, and then asked me if I'd want to talk about theism. At first, I thought maybe not so much because it's not something that I'm very passionate about. But then I thought about it, and I thought that it would be really nice and refreshing to have an actual debate / discussion with a genuine person that is not a con man, that holds a belief, a defensible belief that we can have a discussion about, as opposed to trying to explain science to a liar. You know what I mean? So
yeah.
You know.
That was actually one of the things I was curious to ask you about, is like what sparked the interest in a discussion about God. But it sounds like it was more Andrew kind of running the idea by you, and I guess you're having enough interest in the conversation.
I mean, I'm just I've been doing academic tutorials for a really long time, but I love to discuss things, and I'm very interested in becoming more of a public figure, and I would like to do debates, and I would like to give more talks and things. So I figure, if that's something that I'm interested in, well, you have to do it. So I just started saying yes to debates, and the first few that I said yes to, I mean, they were fun and all, but I'd like to do something a little more constructive. So that's why I said yes to this. I was like, okay, this is a little bit different than the 3-ring circuses I've been participating in lately. So let's give that a shot. Yeah.
Well, cool. It sounds like we're on the same page. And I mean, Andrew, I know Andrew, I guess, has seen me have a couple my big thing is I had a couple formal debates with a really prominent atheist named Matt Dillahunty. And then I guess Andrew came across my name through those. And then every now and then twice, he's said, "Hey, you should have a conversation with this guy," and a guy named Skylar Fiction, and I think one other. And I told him I love these conversations in general, not not in terms of like, oh, I want content out there, but I enjoy exploring people's worldviews more than anything. And for me, it's less. If you can see some of my like sit down interactions, even with Matt. For me, I love philosophy for philosophy's sake. And for me, it's a cooperative endeavor of truth seeking. And, here's where I am. I'm a theist right now, but I like to throw my ideas out there for testing. And I'm sure you do too. And that's kind of all that I'm hoping we'll do, is like, hey, here are some things you might not have thought of before. And here's some stuff maybe I haven't thought of. And we'll just see where it goes from there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's knowledge seeking and truth seeking mixed with just a good, solid mental exercise,
Right on.
So.
Okay. Well, I don't know if you had an idea of like how you'd want to approach the question. I was thinking in my conversations with people who don't believe in God, non-theists is what I'll call them. Sometimes, like especially like with Matt, a lot of it ends up having to do with our epistemology, our, how do you come to know true things? What does that look like? And Matt has a very peculiar epistemology. Like, it's not on the academic scene, but because of how he's configured his way of knowing, and he'll tell you this, there's really no evidence he can think of that would allow him to even believe in God's existence. That's a relatively radical view, but everybody's got their own epistemology. And so I've one of the things I've come to try to do in conversations where I'm trying to meet minds with people is kind of put my epistemology on the table right off the bat. Because if we don't, if we can't come to terms on the epistemology even a little, then it would be hard to make progress. And if you've seen my interactions with Matt, you'll know I'm a very what's called Bayesian about epistemology? I don't know if you've ever been exposed to that idea at all.
I mean, I'm vaguely familiar.
Okay.
But by no means an expert.
Okay. Can I throw just like a quick introduction to how I approach that?
Yeah, go for it, because I don't really have much of an opening statement, so you can go for it.
Okay. And
Yeah.
this is just a model for knowing. It has nothing to do with God so far, but basically, what Bayesian epistemology is a way of thinking about our beliefs and the confidence we have in them and how we update our beliefs in light of new evidence. It looks at probability, and it thinks of probability in terms of credence values. So in other words, if I say, hey, Dave, how likely is it do you think that God exists? You would come back, and if you were like a complete agnostic, you had no idea, you'd say, well, I think there's like a 50% chance that God exists. You're not telling me something about frequency here. You're telling me something about your cognitive state. And that's fine. Anybody can start wherever they want. The issue is, how do you update your belief as new evidence comes along? And that's what Bayesian epistemology is supposed to help us do. And usually there's two parts of this. You're going to start with your prior probability. So like, you might start out thinking there's a 50% chance God exists. That's your prior probability, but that's only one factor. Now you've got to take into account any new evidence that comes along, and that's the second factor. And you, of course, need to consider the evidence for and against. And there's a whole mathematical way of representing how you update all of that. So let me give you an example of differences in prior probability. Have you heard, like in the new atheist movement, of the flying spaghetti monster?
Yeah, is that a Dawkins concept?
Yeah. That's so basically, some people want to liken the God hypothesis to the flying spaghetti monster. And what's interesting about that is, you and I would look at that hypothesis, and even if we have no evidence against it, we think it's highly unlikely that such a thing exists, right? I literally have no evidence against it, or at least nothing that jumps out immediately, but it's highly implausible right off the bat, probably because of how contrived it is, how complex it is. And so this is a consideration of prior probability. And that's also the reason, for example, why it's more probable that aliens exist than that red aliens exist. It's more probable that red aliens exist than red aliens with 10 legs, exactly. Does that make so? Like, the more complexity you add to your theory, that's one way of really hitting its prior probability. And then we said, then there's that second part where we look at the evidence, and the way Bayesians look at evidence is in terms of expectations again. So imagine like two urns. One has 99 white balls and one black ball in it, and the other has 99 black balls and one white ball in it. And let's say I blindfold you and I say, look, I'm going to put one of these urns in front of you. You got to reach in and grab a ball. You do, and it turns out that it's a black ball. Now, that's not enough to prove which urn you drew from, but it is, I think you'd agree, it's evidence that you drew from the urn that had 99 black balls. Why?
Well, it's a higher probability. It's a much higher probability, and therefore a wiser to believe that it was that one.
Exactly. And it's not just that it's more probable that you drew from that urn, but you can even say how much more probable. It's like, look, there's a 99% chance I drew from the urn with 99 black balls.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, this is... Sorry, actually, yeah, no, you finish.
No, please continue. Yeah, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just I can see how this kind of thinking is very applicable to, like, who committed a crime, or very tangible, readily explore things that can be readily explored and probed. It's very difficult for me to imagine how you could begin to quantify these kinds of probabilities from thinking about something as abstract as the existence of a deity. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So. I feel you. So I'll give some thoughts on that. It sounds like you're getting a general grasp though of how it works, because not everything is right as specific as the urn, but even like if you're thinking of like a murder case, that's definitely less, that's more subjective than the urn case. So for example, if I'm saying, John is the murderer, or that's the hypothesis that we're asking, is John the murderer? And then we come across the murder weapon with fingerprints that match John's. Okay. Well, now what's the probability that you would have fingerprints like that if John were innocent? And what's the probability that you'd have, John like fingerprints if he were guilty? I mean, it's hard to put an exact number on it, where there's a little bit of guesswork, but you don't need
you could conceive of it.
Yeah, you don't need
things
an
go
exact
up and
number.
down.
Right.
Yeah.
You don't need, I think you'd agree, we don't need an exact number there. We can get anything like a range, and it's enough for us to say, okay, well, clearly this data fits better on the hypothesis that John is guilty, even if we don't know the specifics. And I think if you look in, because I study philosophy, that's where I spend most of my time. Most academic philosophers will go ahead and jump into this sort of discussion, and they'll try to use numbers that are not controversial. They'll try to be like super modest. Stuff that, because they don't need to give you anything precise. They just need to say, look, it's obviously at least a little more probable that evil would exist if there were no God. Like they'd say something along those lines to help warrant the problem of evil. Isn't it a little bit surprising that there's evil in the world if there were a God, on the assumption that God is all good? And they'll try to invite you to give some minimums on that. So that's kind of, they'll try to be safe about it. So anyways, I mean, I guess the best place to start is just finding out where you are kind of on that question of God's existence. So like, if you ask me, hey, Blake, what is the likelihood you think of God's existence? I would say, well, I'm probably in the, I'm like 99% sure. I think the likelihood is, I think there's like a 99% chance that God exists. So my credence value is like 0.99 that for God's existence, probably a little 0.999. So I'm pretty confident, not certain, but confident. And again, an agnostic would be 0.5. Where would you be on that scale right now?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm not really understanding. Like, to me, that's a metric describing the conviction of your belief. Right. It's not really describing any physical reality. I cannot conceive of how you could quantify such a thing. I do not believe in a God simply because I do not see any evidence for one. But I could never. But obviously, it is possible that there is one. But so beyond that, I definitely cannot. It is anywhere between 0 and 1. I'm not positive that there is no God, and I'm not positive that there is a God. Yeah. But what it is in between, I have no idea of what algorithm you could possibly employ to arrive at a number.
Well, you actually could. In fact, the way that Bayesians will invite you to think about your numbers, they'll usually frame it in terms of betting. So we can look at some of your betting behavior to see what your beliefs are like. So for example, imagine there are these, you have some money. Let's say you've got $1, okay? And you own this dollar, and this dollar in your hand turns into a ticket. And here's the rules of the ticket. The ticket has a proposition written on it, like, the universe exists, or 2 + 2 = 4, or God exists. Okay. And here's the thing is if the proposition is true, this ticket is worth $1. Okay. So if you had a ticket, if you had $1 in your hand and it transformed into a ticket that said 2 + 2 = 4, it's like, whatever, I didn't lose any money. It's perfectly, I'm not sad at all. But if your ticket turned into one that said 2 + 2 = 8, you're like, well, dang it, I just lost my $1. Does that make sense so far?
Not really. What? So it's only worth $1 if the thing is true? I'm not following.
Yes, if the proposition written on the ticket is true, then it's worth $1. If the proposition is false, it's worth nothing. So if your ticket turned into, there's a flying pig out your window, how much is that ticket worth? I mean, nothing. Yeah, huh?
Well, unless we genetically engineer flying pigs, I don't know.
Yeah, but you would say, look, it's so insanely unlikely that there's a pig outside my window, that this ticket is obviously worth virtually nothing. Whereas if the ticket said 2 + 2 = 4, you're like, well, this is worth $1, because that's definitely true.
But these examples that you're citing, we know for sure that 2 + 2 = 4.
Right.
And we know what pigs are, and none of them have wings or have ever had wings to date.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I don't know.
So here's another one, though. Now the ticket says the quarter, let's say you're about to flip a quarter, the quarter you're about to flip lands on heads. Okay? How much is this ticket worth? You wouldn't say $1. It's not worth $1, right? But it's not worth nothing.
Cents.
What?
So it's worth 50 cents?
Right. It's worth, right. This ticket would be worth 50 cents. And you should value it as a 50-cent ticket. Now, what this tells you, it tells you something about your confidence that it's going to land on heads. In the same way, Trump is going to win the next election. How much is that ticket worth to you? Well, that depends on how, if you're 50-50 on that, it's going to be 50 cents again. What about, there are models where the Big Bang is like the absolute beginning. Okay. There's no pre-Big Bang era. How much is that ticket worth to you? How confident are you? For me, I would say the ticket's worth 90 cents, because I'm not absolutely sure. So that's an example. And so obviously this brings us to the final question. If the ticket said you had $1 in your hand and now the ticket turned into God exists, would you feel like you lost your money?
Well, I lost some money because it ain't $1.
Yeah, it's okay. So you're telling me you're definitely not certain that God exists.
Of course.
But do you think that, well, dang it, this ticket's only worth 50 cents to me? I expect it's only worth 50 cents, or what would you say it's worth to you?
I mean, again, I cannot possibly choose a number because all the examples you're listing, I mean, the probability of a quarter landing on heads or tails, we know precisely what that probability is just as well as we know that 2 + 2 = 4. And even something as abstract as cosmology, we have scientific evidence that supports these things. So we can be very confident in science about things. Probably never 100%, but as you said, 90, 99, something like that. But I have a basis upon which to cite that number. With the existence of a deity, I do not have anything whatsoever upon which to base a number. I cannot give you one. I mean,
well, just to be clear though, I mean, we're in this scenario. If I said, hey, I'm going to give you $1 for your ticket, you'd say, take my ticket, definitely take my ticket. If I said, I'm going to give you 25 cents for that ticket, would you give me the ticket?
I mean, just for the sake of propelling the conversation, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I don't believe in God. So my belief is such that I'm going to assign a low number to that.
Okay,
less than a quarter, let's say. But I'm not basing that on anything reliable other than my personal belief.
And that's fine. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just so you know, you have philosophical intuitions at the bottom of your epistemology. Okay, your foundation of knowing. And intuitions can be a starting place. That doesn't make you irrational. You've got to do your best. Okay. Yeah, that's all I'm trying to find out is where you are. So if maybe I'm guessing if I said, hey, I'll give you a penny for that ticket, you'd say, no, I'm not. I mean, it's worth more than a penny. I think the probability that God exists is higher than 1%.
I mean, even there, I don't know, because we have so many definitions to go over. I mean, what is God?
Well,
what qualifies as a God? And
no, you're right. You're right. We should have done that from the get-go. So let's define God as greatest conceivable being. Most academic philosophers on either side trying to think about that would suggest that means God has sort of this maximal amount of power, maximal amount of knowledge, maximal goodness, unsurpassably good. So those are some of the traditional attributes that are associated with being the greatest possible being. If that's our model, if that, the Western notion of God that gets talked about in peer-reviewed publications in Western philosophy, if that's our model of God, and I'm asking you, how much is this ticket worth that says that this God exists? It sounds like you're not agnostic. It sounds like you're a little bit further skeptical.
Yeah,
You think
I skew atheist. I mean, or I would identify as an atheist. Yeah.
sure. Okay.
I do not
So
believe in such an entity. Yeah.
right, but in addition to lacking belief, you also believe God probably doesn't exist, right?
Sure.
And then the question is how much. Anyways, we don't have to belabor the point. I was hoping to I mean, maybe you're like, oh, I think there's a 10% chance God exists, or maybe I think there's a 0.0001. Whatever it is, let's just, we'll pretend we picked it out. We found what it is, okay? And
Okay.
then what we
Let's
want
say
to
a
do is,
penny.
what?
I'll
A
give
penny,
you.
okay.
I'll just give you 1% for the sake of argument. Yeah.
Cool. That's all we need. And now
Okay.
the next step is for, hey, let's think about the evidence. So I know that you think the likelihood's about 1%, which perfectly contrasts with my thinking that, there's probably like a 99% chance that God exists. And now we get to go to stage 2. And that is, let's look at the evidence and see what this does to where we started. And we can go either way. Either I can try to, we can talk about the prior probability, because sometimes that you say you don't know and there's no way to know how to pick like even a prior probability for God. But I think that there are things that we can talk about. For instance, we can talk about whether God is more like a flying spaghetti monster, which I think the prior probability is just insanely low of a flying spaghetti monster existing. And correspondingly, it would take an insane amount of evidence to convince me that a flying spaghetti monster exists. So if you think God is like a flying spaghetti monster, that's a problem. We have to talk about that. But you might instead think that God is more like a Platonic abstract object, like the number one. And there's a lot of debate among even kind of naturalistic philosophers about the virtues of Platonism. Like, hey, maybe there really are, there really does. It's not just that 1 + 1 = 2. It's that the objects in that equation actually exist in some non-physical sense. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the fewer characteristics and attributes that theists apply to their concept of a deity, the less of a problem I have.
Yeah.
It's more of the man in the sky with a beard that cares about what you do with your genitals that bothers me. Just the raw concept of an entity that initiated the existence of the universe. I don't have that big of a problem with that. I don't specifically subscribe to it, but it doesn't bother me. It doesn't rile my, it doesn't ruffle my feathers, I should say,
Yeah, no, that's perfectly rational, and that makes complete sense. But I think that that's a nice place to start. If you're thinking about any more specific models of God, is we should first ask, hey, does God exist in the first place? Does the Western idea of God exist? And if one does, that's really interesting, because that would even serve as, it would like bring a new perspective even to the sciences. It's like, hey, this stuff, like the laws themselves are actually the products of a fundamental mind. That's really cool. I can tell you're someone who treasures knowledge for this, for the sake of it. So we could talk about the prior probability, because I think one of the more interesting arguments for God looks only at a priori stuff. It looks only at, not even physical evidence, but just thinks about, hey, can we basically prove that there is a first uncaused, necessarily existing causer? Okay, because if there is, there would be arguments that it's not natural, that it would explain the natural world instead. So that would be one topic we could kind of go into. Alternatively, we could go into like, hey, what's some physical evidence? It sounds like if you're at 1%, that would suggest to me it would make sense for us to talk maybe about the physical evidence, because evidence can quickly bump up that number.
I mean, my charitable donation of the 1% is not really so much based on anything physical. It's more based on my admission that if you subscribe to, say, the God of the Gaps, that I must admit that the God of the Gaps, although relegated to the first infinitesimal instant after the initial singularity, still lives comfortably there. You know what I mean? There is no scientific explanation for the initial singularity. Therefore, I must concede that it is, you know, it is a reasonable belief that a deity initiated the universe. There is, as of yet, no scientific explanation for that event. Remarkably, after 10 to the negative 36 seconds or so, we know a lot. And I think that's incredible testament to the progress that we've made in the 20th and 21st centuries. And furthermore, I think that there's no firm reason to believe that we won't eventually get that last little bit too. But whether we do or don't, we certainly don't have it now. And that's where that infinitesimal, you know, that's why I say 1 cent or whatever it is, because, you know, it's a reasonable thing to believe that there is an entity that initiated the beginning of the universe. So it's more that. So we can go either way. I mean, I think there's plenty to talk about.
And I actually, you know, even though I'm a theist and I want to try to persuade you of theism, I actually don't think that that's a good argument for even there being 1% personally, because I mean, whenever you make, you know, you frame it as like God at the gaps, and it's important to know that we don't. When someone says, "Hey, like there's no good scientific explanation for this, therefore God," what they really mean is that they're actually they're taking a Bayesian approach. They're saying, look, if God exists, this phenomenon is quasi-expected, whereas if God doesn't exist, this phenomenon is very surprising. So like I've never appealed to God when my socks go missing. It's like a mystery to me. Where did my dadgum sock go? But
I mean, the origin of the universe is a little bit more mysterious than where your socks went. All I mean is that we know that lightning is not Zeus in the clouds, for sure. We do not know for sure that there is no entity that began the universe. I mean, you know, so there's room for that belief, you know, still.
Okay, so we can talk about prior probability. We can talk. I think I'm going to go to evidence, kind of based on what you're saying. The other thing that you know, we want to give space to, if you want to talk about it, is any evidence against God. Those are the three factors: prior probability, evidence for, evidence against. I thought maybe you'd appreciate an argument from fine tuning might be a neat place to start. For some people that I've spoken with, that has some like punch to it, and you can present it pretty quickly.
I think it's a reasonable argument, but there are very reasonable responses to it as well.
Well, let me present kind of the version that I like, and then you tell me what you think of it, and we can explore that. So, you know, as before, I'm going to take my hypothesis of theism, and I'm going to try to present a piece of data like those fingerprints, and I'm going to say, wait a second, this data fits a lot better on theism than on atheism. And more than that, it actually fits much better. It actually, like, the more that it fits the hypothesis, the better evidence it is for that hypothesis. So all we need to do is we need to get the probabilities for, and real quick, this is not a proof for God's existence. Okay. The most it can be is evidence. It's just like evidence. Fingerprints. Okay. There can be counter evidence and whatnot, but here's an evidence. If God existed, this greatest possible being, all good, I want to say it's not crazy, improbable that God would freely choose to make a world that permits life. Why? Well, because of all the good involved in moral interactions. You know, it's the kind of thing that a traditionally conceived God would value. So it's not crazy that he would freely choose to do it. Is that sensible to you?
Well, I think that the conclusion logically follows from the premise, but I don't think that the premise is valid, because you're trying to demonstrate the existence of God using the premise that God exists. You know what I mean?
No, I don't think so. So let's say I'm asked, this is a belief that you can come to even as an atheist. And atheists do come to this sort of belief all the time. They'll say, look, I don't believe in God, but if God existed, creating a world that permits life is the kind of thing God might plausibly choose to do. You know, maybe there's like a 50% chance or even a 1% chance that God might choose to do something like that because he's allegedly all good. Mind you, I don't believe in God. I'm just saying if God existed, that's kind of a natural expectation.
I concede that that conclusion is it's reasonable to draw that conclusion based upon that premise. I reject the premise. That's the whole basis of the conversation.
You're familiar with conditional probability, right? When we do
no.
Well, whenever we do conditional probability, which is always part of our thinking, we always think, look, I mean, you do this every day. You do conditional probability. You say, I don't believe X, but if X were the case, I would anticipate this to this degree. Yeah. That's just part of human reasoning. So I mean, it's not granting the premise. It's just conditional probability. Okay. And that's all we're doing here.
In any case, the validity of the argument is fine. So.
Yeah. So the conditional probability, like if God existed, what's the likelihood that God would create a life permitting world? I don't know, call it somewhere between 1% and 50% chance that God would choose to do something like that. Whatever. Okay. Now you ask, what's the likelihood that you would have a life permitting universe if God didn't exist, if atheism were true? And here's where we have this so-called principle. It's a weird name, but that's what it's called, where if you have the relevant statistics, they should inform your probability. And what that means is if we can find actual evidence saying that the number of ways that the universe could have been, looking at that range, only the smallest bit of it would be life permitting. You need to, if you're rational, affix your belief to that range. In other words, if only 1% of the range is life permitting, you should think that the likelihood that the universe would be life permitting is 1%. And if you think that, then, and this is what physicists regularly do, you'll say, hey, it's actually pretty surprising that we are in a life permitting world. That's really neat. Like, whoa, hey, the universe is life permitting. And the more we learn about fine tuning and the more of these examples in the initial conditions, in the physical constants, the more we see the ways that we could have failed to exist, the more surprising it is that here we are, like we made it through that minefield, so to speak. Okay.
Yeah, it's totally. Sorry, oh, did you have more? Or?
No, please.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a totally valid line of inquiry. I just think it's very anthropic. I mean, we've said the same about life on Earth for a long time, but once we realized how many trillions upon trillions of planets there are, when you take infinitesimal odds and you match it up with, astronomical opportunities, you get near certainty of occurrence. So, I mean, that doesn't mean that we can't discuss this because it is a problem that has to be addressed. So there's three things that come to mind. Number one would be that we don't know specifically that these fundamental constants that you're discussing, that you're citing, have inherent variability, or if they do, what margin of variability they have. We don't know necessarily that they exist on an arbitrary on a spectrum of any number of arbitrary values. I mean, maybe they do. I'm not sure. Number two, there's those who say that these constants can somehow have existed in some kind of superposition in the first instant, which I don't know nearly enough about quantum mechanics to say whether that makes sense or not, apart from saying that I know superposition is a thing that exists, and when the universe must have been of infinitesimal size, then quantum mechanical logic would hold true. And then the third, obviously a lot of people evoke the concept of a multiverse, and I think that that's a totally fair solution, just in the way that imagining trillions upon quadrillions of planets in the universe, a few of them are going to have life. I feel the same way about this universe being one of those that may exist. And the only ones that are going to have conscious entities pontificating about their existence within them are going to be those handful that were fine-tuned for life. So, I'm not an expert on anything I just said, but
no, that's good. And those are
yeah.
You've really covered the academic range of responses. Well, the second one I don't get. I haven't heard that one before. I don't quite understand what's going on there. But for that, the first one,
Hawking said something to that effect.
Superposition.
Yeah,
I'm sure
and I mean, I'm vaguely familiar with the concept of a superposition. I know that there are physical constructs that can hold, multiple values for a particular parameter at once until they are probed and they collapse into a particular value. Then again, we're usually talking about like an electron. We're not talking about like the cosmological constant. So like, I don't know if it's even really a valid thing to say.
And I imagine that would actually go under the multiverse model, because if it only happened once, then it would just re-invoke the same question. Like, isn't it amazing that of all the ones that it collapsed onto this particular one? It
was selected. Yeah. Why was that one selected?
Unless it happened many times, then it would. So I think that fits best. Let's go ahead and collapse that one into the multiverse model. That would be the most charitable way to think about it. And just to it sounded like you grasped how the argument worked. Just in terms of, I just want to double check. Just in terms
I'm familiar with the argument. I mean, I know that there are certain constants that if they were slightly different would not allow for the formation of stars and galaxies and so forth. And so that's obviously a huge problem for the development of life.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't just mean like, hey, do you know about like the cosmological constant? If you change it one part in 10 to the 120th power, the universe collapses in a picosecond or it's gone. I don't just mean that. I mean, like, go back to the form. It's very important to get the structure of the argument. And I want to confirm that you do have the structure, that this is a Bayesian face-off. This is evidence in terms of the fact that we have two models of what reality is like, the theist and the atheistic. On theism, that the universe is life permitting is not that surprising. It's not crazy. It's like, whoa. On atheism, we want to say that it is surprising, and we can even kind of put a value on how surprising it is, because we can say the chances of the universe being life permitting are like 1 in at least 10 to the 120th power. Okay, so if you compare these two numbers together on traditional Bayesian thinking, this would not just be tiny evidence. This would be super strong evidence because of the disparity of the numbers.
Okay? Yeah, but one of the models requires that a deity exists, and the other does not. So it's a pretty huge factor that must be considered.
Very good, and that factors into what I said earlier, which is this is only evidence, it's not proof. So if you posit an entity that has an extremely low prior probability, for example, or an entity which has a lot of evidence against it, then even if we have a lot of evidence for it, that doesn't mean it's justified. That doesn't mean you're warranted in believing the thing exists.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're on the same page. I agree with you. I'm not saying that therefore God exists.
Yeah, I mean, it's about as good, or it's probably the best argument I can conceive of for the existence of a God, but it still doesn't, it does not sway me.
Okay.
I would say.
And part of that is going to inevitably be because you see some ways out. It's not crazy that there's a relevant kind of multiverse that would solve the problem.
No, I mean, why should this be the only universe?
Yeah.
Again, we don't have any direct evidence of another universe existing. So, again, once we get down to this stuff that's so bare bones, I mean, it's just so fundamental, the tiniest, I mean, it's just, this is the most basic building blocks of logic in existence. We're going to encounter some very counterintuitive things, but yeah.
So what I'd like to do, in part, what I want to persuade you, I want our minds to meet, because I think it has a lot of force, and I want you to feel the force that I feel when I think about it, and that means telling you what I think of these objections you have. Because if I can sort of do something to these objections and remove them, that you'll feel the argument at least a little bit more. Okay, so let me talk about the first one first. You said we don't know that the constants have. We don't know whether they have an inherent variability, and if they do, to what margin.
Yeah.
Just to simplify, start with the hypothesis that, in fact, the laws as we know them are necessitated to be exactly what they are. Okay, every single one of them. Forget the variability, or forget the margin part right now. As Carr and Reese pointed out, even if every one of these was necessitated, what this actually does is kick the problem upstairs because if they're necessitated, that means there's a meta law that's fixing all of them to be what they are. Okay, so think of it this way. Imagine if we found out like the first chapter of Genesis written in the stars from our vantage point. Okay, and I'm like, dude, this is evidence, Dave. And then you come back and say, well, I don't know, maybe there's like some super law that dictated that, that exact thing came about.
But that would be evidence. Yeah. Stars writing Genesis 1:1 in the night sky. That would be evidence of the Christian God. That's actually a pretty funny example of something that would turn me into a Christian, probably.
Good. But the reason why it's evidence for you, again, presumably, is because it's not crazy surprising if God existed, but it is crazy surprising if God didn't exist. And so you're thinking, what's the likelihood of this if God existed? I don't know, 1%, or you could even say 0.0001% chance. But if God doesn't exist, the chance of that in the night sky would be like 0.00000000001.
Yeah.
And then you compare those two numbers, you notice the disparity, and you're like, dang, that's really good evidence for God. And I'm saying the exact same thing here. And what I want you to notice, though, is your objection would apply to, you could raise the same objection to the message in the night sky. And you could say, well, look, maybe it was necessitated by underlying laws of physics. Maybe there's a meta law, a higher level law that necessitated ultimately that this message got written out. Right?
But I mean, it's just that if a universe is to exist, it must have characteristics. And if it is going to have characteristics, perhaps it is simply that the set of characteristics it has is the most preferable for some singular reason. There is I mean, I want to say something along. I understand chemistry, so I think of the lowest energy possible. So complexity only arises when it's thermodynamically favorable, because there's a release in energy. It's a dispersal of energy, which is entropically favorable. So I'm not quite sure, because I'm not a physicist, how to analogize that to the earliest states of the universe. But I'm trying to think of some way of articulating that concept of just these parameters are the way they are because that's the simplest way that it could be. You know what I mean?
Well, it's not about simplicity. Ultimately, even in the chemistry example, you're going to cite one or more laws of physics. Okay. These are real laws of physics. It's not just about, going to the lowest energy. I mean, that happens to be a coincidence of that particular law. What's most important is that you have the law to begin with. You have laws that explain it. And so when you're appealing ultimately to higher level
it's kind of a summary of the law, though. It's kind of a summary of the law.
That's fine. But the point is there is a law that explains it. And all I'm saying is if there were a message in the night sky like that, you could likewise say that, well, look, there's a law that dictated all of the other laws would come together and put this message exactly like it is. And immediately you and I recognize, well, that actually pushes the probability up to the meta law. This is relevant to fine tuning, because if you want to say that, look, maybe everything these laws had to be what they are. We don't know why, but the cosmological constant had to have the exact value that it has, which is pretty widely rejected by physicists right now, just so you know. But even if it were, the only way it would be forced into that spot is if, in fact, there were some higher level theory. In fact, you need multiple, because we're not just dealing with constants. So it's not like the laws can merge together. You're dealing with initial conditions as well. These are very separate kinds of things. But whatever, you have a couple things that come together in a sort of meta explanation. What you're doing is you're kicking the same exact improbabilities upstairs. So a lot of that's usually, this is why most philosophers who are thinking about the fine-tuning problem don't go to that explanation. They'll usually go to the multiverse explanation as our best chance. So you'll usually see it framed as God or the multiverse.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably inclined to lean towards multiverse, but again, when we're talking about the evolution of the universe from the initial singularity, if we're going to talk about a singular entity or datum or duality or whatever is the very first thing that appeared, everything that fragmented from there, right? We know that all the fundamental forces were one force and then they fragmented into, right? You can think of a singular law or a singular logical framework that dictates how all of that fragmentation occurs. So you don't necessarily need to explain every single parameter being precisely what it is. I think that it would probably be possible to conceive of a singular explanation for this initial entity from which everything fragmented. Now, to the extent to which a theoretical physicist could tell me whether that makes any sense or not, I'm not sure. But,
yeah, I know. Yeah, so you're talking about like, hey, our grand unified theory could help a little bit. Just so you know, number one, physicists don't think that a grand unified, we've lost a lot of hope in the grand unified theory more recently. But even if there were a grand unified theory, it doesn't explain all the fine tuning. There are constants.
Right. I was just using that as an analogy. Yeah, I was analogizing the forces to what we're talking about here.
Yeah, that would be the meta law hypothesis. So the grand unified theory would cover some of the constants, not all of them. So and so there would still be constants left over that are fine tuned, and you would still have the initial conditions that are fine tuned. And my point about the meta law is, if you look at the grand unified theory, it again, what you'd be doing is you'd be taking all the individual improbabilities and multiplying them together to talk about how crazy is it that the grand unified theory would result in, the proliferation of fine-tuned, it didn't have to do that. I mean, it's surprising that it unleashed these fine-tuned laws of physics. So that wouldn't change the surprise. It's like the proverbial ruck in the carpet. You're just moving it.
I mean, unfortunately, I have essentially zero capacity to think about or discuss the mechanisms by which that fragmentation would occur. So it's so hard I can conceive of how there would be guidelines that directed it towards these values. But I cannot support that. But in the end, it's moot, because for two reasons. Number one, we have this aspect of a multiverse to fall back upon.
Right.
And two, describing or falling back on the necessity of an entity to have designated these parameters, to me, in no way supports the concept of a deity any more than it supports, say, simulation theory or something like that.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and so we can come back to that. I just want to point out very quickly that the guideline idea that you're talking about, it's not about it. Science isn't going to change it. This is just a fact of probability. When you posit a higher level law, you've moved all of the improbability up to whatever that law is, those to the guidelines themselves, because the guidelines could have pushed it in a different direction. We need to talk about, let's talk about simulation theory and the plausibility of that. That'd be great. But first, let's talk about the multiverse hypothesis, because that seems like the biggest one. And again, if my testimony means anything, this is where non-believers will typically go to. They don't usually spend any time on, maybe the laws are necessitated, because they see that pushing the problem back up a little bit. On the multiverse model, it depends on what you're talking about. Usually people are interested in an inflationary multiverse model. Okay. The challenge, though, is that the inflationary multiverse needs to be fine-tuned as well. It turns out there's lots of ways to make an inflationary multiverse, and not all of them are going to result in variability in the kinds of universes it produces. So you could have a multiverse that produces tons of universes that are, that have the same exact cosmological constant that's completely wrong. Mm-hmm. Right? So you'd have to have a very special, fine-tuned kind of multiverse in order to allow for a universe that will ultimately permit life. By the way, I'm not in principle against the multiverse, but it would need fine-tuning on its own. The other thing to think about,
but who's to even discuss the mechanisms by which an individual universe selects these parameters? I mean, we're just getting so abstract that it's it's complete speculation after a certain point.
Yeah, but we don't need to speculate on the fact that if the multiverse weren't right, that if it weren't configured right, if it only produced universes that had a cosmological constant that was different from ours, don't you agree that the multiverse wouldn't help? Like, all it would do is it would produce lifeless universes.
Yeah, but you're fixating on one probability of on one possibility of practically infinite possibilities.
I agree. I mean, I agree with that. But the point just is that if you don't, obviously, I think you agree with this. I mean, this isn't something like we should be disputing.
I mean, what you've just said is correct. If every universe in the multiverse can't produce life, then that's a problem.
Right. So basically, you need a multiverse that produces enough universes. I mean, if it produced 5, if you had a mechanism that produced five universes, that's not going to do anything to the fine-tuning problem. So you need a mechanism that produces enough universes. It can't be producing the same kinds of universe every time. It's got to produce a variation of universes so that that anthropic principle can go to work for us.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is that when you put this together, the kinds of things that are required, you end up needing a significantly fine-tuned multiverse. There's also,
I don't see how that follows. Why do you need if every universe can have any set of parameters, then there specifically is no fine tuning.
You're absolutely right. If the parameters had perfect freedom in changing, then what would end up happening is ultimately, eventually, you'd get a world, a universe that permits life just by chance because of the law of large numbers. You increase your probabilistic resources, you're going to get whatever you want eventually. What I'm saying is that that's a fine-tuned scenario because there are plenty of ways for multiverses or a multiverse mechanism to exist, which doesn't give you the variability, or alternatively doesn't give you that many universes. In which case, either problem would leave us without life. So anyways, the point just is that even when you bring up a multiverse, there's at least some fine-tuning there to reconcile with. I have an additional challenge to this model, the inflationary multiverse model. If it's going to be what's proposed, where there's enough variability and there's enough of them, it faces something called the Boltzmann brain problem. Have you heard of this before?
The brain that just appears or something, or what is it?
Yeah. You might. Do you watch PBS Space, that series?
Space Time with
Space Time.
Aussie guy?
Yeah.
I know him, but I mean, I'm familiar with the channel, but.
Oh, cool. So I know he did did a really good episode on it recently. It's a really big, interesting challenge, and you're right. The idea is that in this sort of inflationary multiverse, it's almost certain that you are a brain that just popped into existence, believing that you're in the middle of a Zoom conversation when in fact you're about to just die. And you have to believe this at every moment.
How does it follow that is a certainty?
Well, because there are far more of these sorts of small local brains that will fluctuate into existence, or that will form by chance, than universes in this like really low entropy state that evolve outward to produce sort of the life permitting realm that we know. So it's a matter of numbers. It's very hard to get a low entropy universe as ours is that evolves outward into planet Earth ultimately, that has then evolved creatures that then can ask the question. That's a relative of the ways to get consciousness. That's a hard task for the universe. For every one time that happens, you're going to have billions upon trillions of times that you get a local accident. A local accident where, for example, a thermal fluctuation where a brain just comes into being that forms the belief.
I'm not following at all. I don't see how you could regard that as more probable than the way life occurred in our universe. In our universe, we have small constituent parts that over billions of years, you had emerging tiers of complexity that eventually generated a brain. Yeah. This is unthinkably more probable than a brain that simply materializes for no reason. I mean, I don't like. You're correct that it is a non-zero probability, but it is such an infinitesimal probability that to even consider it, unless there are literally infinite universes, which is not necessarily something that I would subscribe to not only think that, but to ascribe it as having a higher probability than the way life arose in our universe, I just don't see how that's defensible.
Are you familiar with the fine tuning of entropy?
Refresh my memory.
Let me see if I can. So the universe at the Big Bang is in an extremely low entropy state, right?
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
And this is an extremely improbable state, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's hard. I don't think I know enough about physics to agree or disagree. I mean, if physicists say that, then I agree. But because it's hard to say, because at the first instant of the universe, there was not even any matter. So, I mean, it's there was simply some amount of energy, and then all of these additional components emerged. So I don't know. It's hard for me to conceive of how to describe the entropy of the first instant of the universe. I don't really know how to do it.
Well, what I read is that, and again, I don't think this is controversial. I know, I mean, a lot like Sean Carroll, he contributed to the Blackwell Companion to like Science and Christianity, whatever. He talks about this problem of entropy, and he says like, man, it's almost too fine tuned. And the idea is, if entropy isn't just right, you're not going to get a life permitting universe. You have to have this incredibly low entropy state. Okay. And that's the context of the Boltzmann brain problem, is that it's very difficult to get a low entropy Big Bang state. Okay. Highly improbable. For every one time that you get a low entropy Big Bang state like this, you're going to get many more quantum or thermal fluctuations that produce a brain. It's a brain, this local brain, although it's insanely improbable that it would fluctuate into existence, it would happen countless more times. For every one time that you get a low entropy state Big Bang fluctuating into existence, you'll get countless Boltzmann brains fluctuating into existence. This is Sean Carroll himself will say this.
Yeah. I mean, I'm no physicist, but, two things. Number one, brains require so many constituent parts right? It's an organ, so there's tissue, so there's cells, so there's molecules, so there's atoms, so there's subatomic particles, et cetera. Those all have to be accounted for. And number two, this thing about assessing the entropy of the initial, singularity, I don't like. Entropy is predicated upon microstates, and when you have something that is infinitesimal, I don't see how it's difficult to assess how many microstates you could have. You know what I mean? I understand how you can talk about microstates for a system of particles. You know what I mean? But particles did not exist, right? Matter did not exist. It was just some finite amount of energy, which was obviously a lot of energy because it was the whole universe. But yeah, again, I'm not equipped to talk about entropy in that way. But I mean, the only thing that I know is that for any spontaneous process, the entropy of the universe increases, right? That we know. But I think that follows very logically. There's no aspect of early universe cosmology leading all the way up until the universe as we see it now that to me violates anything about that. You know what I mean? It's hard for me to, So again, it's my own inability to discuss the earliest epoch of the universe in the lens of entropy, but I'm still not getting it.
Let me read one quick thing for you, and then we can move on because I don't want to stick on the point too much. But I've got stuff from Roger Penrose, Luke Barnes, and a guy named Alan Hainline and Sean Carroll here. I'm going to read Sean Carroll's. I don't remember what this quote is, but it's under my notes for this topic. He says, "An example of fine-tuning well beyond anthropic constraints is the initial state of the universe, often characterized in terms of its extremely low entropy. Roughly speaking, the large number of particles in the universe were arranged in an extraordinarily smooth configuration, which is highly unstable and highly unlikely given the enormous gravitational forces acting on such densely packed matter. While vacuum energy is tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 120th power, the entropy of the early universe is tuned to 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the 120th, a preposterous number. The entropy didn't need to be nearly that low in order for life to come into existence. One way of thinking about this is to note that we certainly don't need 100 billion other galaxies in the universe in order for life to arise here on Earth. Our single galaxy would have been fine, or for that matter, a single solar system. That doesn't mean that we can't possibly explain the low entropy of our universe by invoking the multiverse. It just means that the explanation must rely on detailed dynamical properties of the multiverse rather than simply the requirement that life can exist." And he goes on.
I don't understand the extrapolations to the singular galaxy and the singular solar system.
Basically, what he's saying is if you don't have things just right, you're not going to get a large expanding universe. Okay, you have to get a perfect low entropy state of the universe, and this all traces back to the Boltzmann brains problem because almost every fluctuation that you're going to posit is going to collapse immediately. It's not going to work. And for every time that you do get something of this size popping into existence, it's sooner going to be a brain than a solar system, and it's sooner going to be a solar system than a universe. That's the original context of the Boltzmann brain thing. Anyways, we don't need to focus on it if it's something that we need to look into more deeply.
Yeah, I mean, but two things. Number one, who's to say that there aren't a quintillion fluctuations that immediately collapse upon itself for every one time that a universe arises? That's totally feasible. There's no problem with that. And just number two, I'm still not getting it. I mean, unless we're talking about a brain, unless we're not talking about a literal brain, and we're just talking about some kind of network of, I don't know, because the existence of a human brain, if that's what we're talking about, a literal brain like the kind that is inside my skull, predicates the precise history of this universe and every emergent tier of reality that has come about of this particular universe. You know what I mean?
My understanding is that yes, it is logically possible, even though it's insanely improbable. It's logically possible for it wouldn't actually be human because there'd be no history. but for a replica of a human brain to fluctuate into existence, it's
yeah,
not impossible.
it's a non-zero probability, but
Right.
to me, it's unthinkably less probable than the history of the universe that we live in
Okay,
today.
and that's where Sean Carroll is going to come back and say, hey, Dave, actually, you've got a misunderstanding here. You're not taking into account how improbable a low entropy singularity Big Bang, I shouldn't say singularity, but a low entropy Big Bang scenario is. You're completely missing how improbable it is.
But why does this spontaneous generation of neurons and neural tissue require any different an entropic state? I mean, if for that to fluctuate, all of these other particles and substructures of matter must also be possible.
It's
You
gonna.
know what I mean?
Yeah. No.
I mean, there's probably something I'm just not getting, but I'm not.
Yeah. I get it.
Sean Carroll's smarter than me, but
yeah. Me too.
I'm not. That doesn't make an ounce of sense to me.
Okay, well, hey, that's that's part of like the joy of what we're doing. Is it something to look into after the conversation? So I've focused on one evidence for God, and if we're going like for about I don't know I honestly don't have a time limit. For me this is just fun conversation, but I don't want to hog all the time making a case for God. But I have lots of evidence if you want to go there and see what you think about him, or alternatively, if you had an argument against God's existence that you'd want to think about with me, we could look at that too. What would be most interesting to you?
I mean, I'll say one thing, and then we can go back to whatever evidence you want. I mean, for me, everything just hinges on the notion that I think a lot of theists arrive at theism because they have a problem with the universe being causeless, and I just don't see how the creation of another causeless entity that is necessarily more complex, if not infinitely more complex than the universe, is a viable solution to that problem. So I just, to me, Occam's razor would suggest that you just chop it off there, right? Why create another causeless entity to cause this universe, right?
Yeah,
you're just extending the problem.
Yeah, great question. I think I might be able to help with that. Have you heard of this is like one of the most, if you're getting into like the debates over God kind of stuff, if like you're getting any interested in that at all, you're going to run across something called the Kalam cosmological argument. Have you ever heard of this?
So I'm sure I ran across it. I don't recall them.
All right, so let me throw it at you. It'll help, I think. What it says, and this will mark out the difference, so you can pick out the difference. What it says is premise one: whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now, I want to really focus on this. Nobody in history says everything that exists has a cause. Okay. For example, if the universe were past eternal, nobody would be saying it needs a cause. In fact, there's no room for a cause. But what philosophers will say is that if it begins to exist, then it has a cause. That's premise one. Premise two is that the universe did begin to exist. And the conclusion is that therefore the universe has a cause. And then, there are lots of ways to formulate the cosmological argument. With the Kalam cosmological argument, which places special emphasis on time, says obviously whatever caused the very realm of space, time, and matter would have to exist independently of space, time, and matter in order to be a sufficient cause. So the relevance, the reason why you wouldn't just say, well, the universe is, the stopping point, is because the universe has a beginning. And many philosophers find it intuitive to say that if it has a beginning, then it has a cause. Whereas people have usually said God doesn't have a beginning. God is timeless. And that means that the intuition that leads us to seek a further cause doesn't exist for it. It's uniquely for things with a beginning.
Yeah, I think that this argument pits two logical absurdities against each other. So I certainly accept premise two, but I reject premise one. I do not believe that everything with a beginning must have a cause, because there must be something without cause. And I think it's somewhat of an ad hoc solution to just say that there is a deity that exists outside of time. But to say that something exists outside of time or has existed eternally in the past, or however you want to frame it, is a logical absurdity to rival, or in my opinion, greater than the absurdity that something can begin without cause. You know what I mean? I think that these are both very absurd things to believe, but one of them is true. So
Well,
I buy the second one.
Okay, so yeah, you like the second premise, but you're not sure about the first premise. Whatever begins.
No. I meant the second of these two possibilities. There are two absurd things. Either something exists either eternally into the past or outside of time that has no cause, or the universe began without cause. Right? These are two possible things. They're both ridiculous. I mean, these are both really insane, unintuitive, crazy things, but one of them is true, and I think it's the second one.
You think that there is just a beginning without a cause?
Yeah, I mean, and if it's not, or if it's not the beginning of our universe, that it's the beginning of something. I do not evoke a causeless deity to explain this. So whether there's a multiverse or whether this is a simulation, but there's a higher tier, another, whatever. Just I believe that there was a beginning without cause. And if you're going to say that, then why not just let it be this universe? Because it's the simplest way to do it.
Yeah. But then doesn't that mean that you're rejecting that principle that, sometimes called the causal principle, that whatever begins to exist has a cause?
Yeah, I have to therefore reject premise one of the argument you just put forward.
Okay. So there's two ways to go. One is to talk about the consequences philosophically of rejecting the causal principle. Like that's because I think that you should accept this causal principle if you want to have a nice, clean worldview. And just so you know, the hypothesis wouldn't be that God exists eternally into the past.
Right.
The hypothesis is rather that God is timeless. On traditional theism, the model is that there is a necessary, that is, it kind of like 2 + 2 = 4 is a necessary truth. I don't care what you do to reality, 2 + 2 is going to equal 4. There's no such thing as a possible world. It's just philosopher speak for a possible reality. There's no such thing as a possible reality where 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4.
I would be inclined to agree. Philosophers say a lot of pretty far out things.
Well, okay. Let me.
I think that's
careful.
true. I don't know.
I'm talking about analytic philosophers. So there's branches of philosophy, and I'm talking about the guys who really like math and precision. Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of philosophy where I'm like, you're smarter than me, and I should listen to you. And then there's some where I'm like, I think that you're just taking the piss, man. That's not.
Yeah,
But maybe you're just a lot smarter than me. I don't know.
Yeah. Just if you're going to get into philosophy, stick with analytic philosophy. You're exactly right.
One day I will tackle this mountain. I have learned very little philosophy, but I got to get into it at some point.
Okay, so just so you know what the model is so philosophers will, in like modal logic, they'll distinguish between what's necessary and what's contingent. 2 + 2 = 4 is a necessary truth. Planet Earth exists is what they would call a contingent truth. It didn't have to be that way. There could have been a reality without a planet Earth. There's nothing incoherent about that. Okay. And they're also, that's de dicto modality. Then there's de re modality. This is some things necessarily exist or contingently exist. If you're a Platonist, for example, you think that, like I said before, abstract objects really exist. They're not physical. They don't even stand in causal relations, but they're really there. Okay.
You mean like an idea or a feeling or something?
No, it's not even a feeling.
Like a mental construct, a memory or something, or
no, they're not. They're not psychological. Yeah, they
explain
won't.
It to me then.
Yeah. They're not even going to say, for Platonists, they don't think that abstract objects are psychological. They think that they're extramental entities that exist because they actually exemplify properties. They're not physical properties, but they do exemplify properties. And if you believe in these abstract objects, which many philosophers do who are naturalistically inclined, even do so because of it helps them solve certain puzzles. So that's why they believe they exist. I'm not coming down on a position in that. I'm just saying that if they exist, they're the kind of thing that exists necessarily. So just as 2 plus 2 equals 4 is true in every possible reality, if Platonists are right, the number 1 exists in every possible reality. Not saying it actually does. I'm just telling you what the model is, so you know what necessity and contingency are. What theists will say is because God is the greatest possible being, God could not fail to exist. God, if God exists, is a necessary being. Part of being necessary and not being contingent is going to be timelessness. There's no such thing as a necessary thing that depends on time. So the relevance of this to what you were saying before is that there's a certain inherent plausibility in positing something necessary as a stopping point to your foundation. If you're trying to explain everything, like where did all this come from? Where does it end?
Yeah.
There's an inherent plausibility, even granted by my favorite atheist is a guy named Graham Opie. By the way, he just had an amazing conversation with a guy named Rob Coons yesterday that was streamed. Highly recommended atheist thinker. He'll say himself, look, most likely reality terminates ultimately in something necessary that could not fail to exist, and everything that's possible is an outworking of chance, branching histories, branching possibilities from that necessary foundation. He doesn't think the necessary foundation is God, but he'll say that there's a necessary foundation of some kind, and this isn't like scientific necessity. This is like really hard. Like if there are scientific laws, the reason why the scientific laws are as they are is explained by the ultimate foundation. And there's an intrinsic plausibility of positing an ultimate timeless foundation to ground the outflowing of everything afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
So when people posit God is filling in that role of what we seem to want. Whereas if you just try to talk about the universe and saying, well, the universe had a beginning, and it was just there because of that little sentence, because it began to exist, that changes the game. That puts it in the category of the contingent. That means it cries out for an explanation. Well, why is it like that instead of like this over here? So anyways, that's how I think of kind of what you were saying, is there's a little bit more plausibility.
But I mean, when you're talking about this void that the entity fills, I mean, to me, that just shrieks ad hoc. In the end, whether you are describing something that began or did not begin, you're still talking about a causeless cause.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, the absurdity of the entity, to me, what I view it as absurd. I think it is an absurdity. It is an absurdity that rivals or exceeds an initial uncaused cause. You know what I mean? For in terms of the beginning of the universe, I think that causality obviously holds true upon the universe existing, but I don't know. To me, just would and I maybe even buy into what you're talking about. Something about a necessity to exist, something necessitating to exist, and I do understand that scientific laws can be based upon this fundamental, most fundamental tier of reality. I just think it's so. I don't know. I mean, that the universe can have begun without cause, and a causeless, timeless entity, it's complete nonsense either way. So
Yeah,
that's how I
I feel you. I would so this is another thing to kind of look into. Consider the model. You don't even have to think God is the necessary foundation, but consider a model where you do have a necessary foundation that causally explains the whether it's the singularity or something, some pre-Big Bang phase. If you have that elegant necessary foundation, your worldview takes on an instant plausibility. There's not just like some gaping problem. You satisfy the philosophical principles. So, anyways, it doesn't have to be God, but that would be what it can.
I mean, the notion that it is impossible for nothing to exist is interesting and begs discussion. And as you said, exploring that possibility does not lead specifically to a deity. So, it's so hard. I mean, it's just so hard when you're thinking about this kind of stuff. Every 30 seconds, you just have like a brain fart, and you're like, "What am I even pondering right now?" It's just so fundamental and so abstract.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay. And what I'll say, I'll finish with this. If it doesn't take you directly to a God in your mind, you can, if it really is something that exists independently of space, time, and matter. We like to give a little extra credit to hypotheses that have fulfilled predictions. And because the God hypothesis was around, I mean, people think that there are these different arguments for God's existence, and some people even they'll give personal testimony. They think they personally experience God. People all over the world. So the hypothesis is on the table.
Weakest evidence imaginable.
Right. Well, I'm not going to comment on that, but the hypothesis is at least on the table. The God hypothesis, and the God hypothesis was saying, hey, there's going to be this fundamental thing that exists independently of space, time, and matter that causally explains the rest of reality. Okay, that was an essential part of the model. And so if we get evidence from new philosophy down the line and new cosmology, it should at least count as a little bit of evidence in favor of that God hypothesis that was on the table. It's not proof, but it's a little bit of, it's some evidence.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, just to me, the issue is the necessity for that entity to be overwhelmingly complex and perhaps infinitely more complex than its creation. That's the part that gets me. If we're gonna worry about the fine tuning of the universe, I mean, why aren't we talking about the fine tuning of the deity? I mean, this deity that is causeless is greater necessarily than its creation. I mean, this is just that's why I say that it is a logical absurdity that rivals, or in my mind eclipses, the logical absurdity of the universe existing without cause.
Dave, you're doing good philosophy. This is good. So what this actually comes back to is the prior probability. Remember before how we were talking about how the complexity of an hypothesis can influence the prior probability? And you're picking up on this because if God is infinitely complex, then even if we have insane evidence for God's existence, it's not going to overcome that initial improbability. I'm with you.
It's a big ask.
Yeah. So what I want to say is that if God exists, God is not infinitely complex. In fact, that's like why, like among all the philosophers talking about God, atheists and non-theists, all of them will say, look, if God exists, God is not complex. In fact, so-called classical theists affirm what's called divine simplicity. Like God is the simplest possible thing in their mind. I don't affirm to divine simplicity myself, but I think God is extremely simple. One thing that helped me understand why God would be simple is, it was two things. One was I would have thought God was insanely complex because of, God's all, like, it seems like every single thing that God can do and every single thing that God can know each count as like individual bits of complexity. Like that's how I, you might initially think about it. It turns out what philosophers are saying is different. Instead, the way you think about it is in terms of lacking limits. So what you'll often hear is that arbitrary limits are the complexity introducers. So what would be really stunning is if we got to the foundation and we found out that it had exactly this precise amount of power and exactly this you take these variables and it's like, why are they exactly like that? That's complex because it cries out for an explanation.
Yeah, it's the fine tuning. It's the fine tuning problem all over again.
Yeah, exactly. But if you want to
so is that necessarily simpler? Is that simpler than attributing it with infinite properties?
Well, what usually you can make your hypothesis simpler by taking things to either 0 or infinite. Okay, right. Unlimited.
So I choose 0.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. If you unless you need the entity,
Right.
But right, you basically what that, and I agree with you, is that's why I would not start tagging on additional properties to the God hypothesis, because that's just going to needlessly add complexity. But I think that each of the properties of God are necessary, and as long as it has those properties, the simplest way to have those properties is without limit. Okay, so in fact, some people think that God is really just this one entity without parts. This is the other big feature, is that complexity comes in virtue of having parts. If God exists, God has no parts. God's knowledge and power are not mediated by systems or anything like that. It's supposed to be this very simple, unbounded mind. And of course, if you're someone who thinks that, look, minds have to be mediated by brains, then that could be part of the problem. I just think it's incoherent for there to exist a mind that doesn't have a brain.
I wouldn't agree with that statement. A computer could one day have a mind.
Okay, well, or a computer, yeah. But if you think
but the problem I have with what you're saying is, are you saying that the deity is infinite or not? Because I thought you said that it was not, but you're removing all limits, and if something is unlimited, then it is infinite.
No, it's infinite.
Okay.
It's qualitatively infinite. It's and unlimited is the technical term, but right, that means you can divide it up into infinite parts if you wanted to. I don't think it's fundamentally made of that, but right, you got the picture.
But then we're opening ourselves up into this. I think fundamentally what I'm saying is that I don't believe in infinity of any kind. I think that there are way too many logical paradoxes that arise when you examine infinity or attribute something with an infinite amount of any particular characteristic or attribute. I mean, all the dumb, can God make a rock so big he can't lift it, or this kind of stuff. These are the paradoxes that make me reject the notion of infinity existing in a concrete way. Mm-hmm. And that on top of the fact that once again we're talking about an uncaused cause that is infinitely more complex than the finite universe. I cannot disprove it, but Occam's razor would suggest, what do we need this thing for? Get rid of it.
Yeah. It's ironic, by the way. Normally it's the theist that's trying to push the impossibility of the infinite. Because they want to try to say that, well, the past is finite, and that means you get to a beginning and you start asking questions about what the beginning is like, and you can get to something quasi-godlike pretty quickly. It's ironic, but you should know when theists talk about God's infinity, they're not talking about a quantitative infinity. They're talking about a qualitative infinity. And it's important, like, even if you talk about, for instance, like God's knowledge, what theists will typically say is God's knowledge is a bit more, it's not carved up into individual pieces that are added together. You can think of it more like a map. you can like describe the map and carve it up in all sorts of different ways, but the map exists prior to any divisions we impose on it. It's kind of like an interval. So there's an interval between this finger and this finger. And you have different philosophers who think about how space is comprised. But, you know, I'm in the camp that says there do not exist an infinity of points from here to here. Okay.
Well, correct.
Now,
and there's a lot of science to demonstrate that.
yeah. So, but here's the point: is even though I can talk about a potential infinity, insofar as I can keep dividing it up mentally, that they're not.
There's no
that doesn't mean
actualized
that,
infinity.
right? That doesn't mean the individual points all have their own existence. So it's not like there's an actual infinity right here. In the same way, when we talk about God's knowledge, we're not saying that there are an actual infinity of independent truths that God knows. Instead, God has the whole interval, and you can divide it up. So that's usually how philosophers will think of God's knowledge. And that means that God doesn't invoke a quantitative infinity, but nevertheless, God is unlimited in what God knows. Does that make sense?
I mean, kind of. But to me, the demonstration of the lack of the infinitesimal physically in the universe supports my notion that infinity does not exist, or my belief that infinity does not exist.
Yeah.
So I look to the
Which I agree.
infinitesimal. And we have a lot of evidence that there is no infinitesimal physically, and also that the universe is not infinitely large, and is certainly not eternal in the past, etc. So everywhere I look in the universe, I see that there's no infinity. And logically, I can't wrap my head around the existence of infinity.
Yeah.
So that to me supports my rejection of an infinite deity, whether you want to talk about it being qualitative or quantitative, or however you want to dress up the infinity.
Here's the thing: is we can get rid of the word infinity then, because it sounds to me like when you're using the word infinity, your mind is jumping to quantitative infinity, which is what all your problems are with. Forget qualitative infinity. I'm just going to say that God is unlimited. Okay. We'll just stick with that. What that means is there aren't a bunch of parts to God, if God exists. And in this sense, God has no arbitrary limits. Okay. God is unlimited with respect to the properties that are essential to God's existence. And if you follow that through, what you get is a remarkably simple thing. Okay. You have to, maybe the biggest stumbling block is you do have to acknowledge the possibility of an unmediated mind, a mind that just floats, so to speak. Okay. So like, imagine, some people, if their brain is messed up in the right way, they're not going to get certain types of physical perception. They might not be able to see or hear. Imagine someone who is messed up enough that they didn't have any physical perceptions whatsoever. But nevertheless, their mind, they'll still have, maybe, you can poke their brain and now they're sad. They have a feeling of sadness. Maybe they'll feel bored. I have no idea what it would be like, but the person is there, and they could say the Cartesian reasoning, I think, therefore I am, but they have no awareness of physical reality. And that person would have a conception of a mind while having no conception of physics. Okay. And throughout history, people have long thought that there are souls, that's what it is. It's a part that doesn't, even though everybody today is going to say that there's an interaction between the brain and the soul, if there is such a thing, a mind. I'm
a materialist, so I don't.
You're a materialist. Yeah, totally, I get it. But here's the thing: is I would say, be open to the possibility of souls. Don't say it's. Don't jump to saying there's no way this could be. If you think it's possible that there's a soul, that such a thing could exist, even if it's mind stretching, but if there could be such a thing, it would actually be a very simple thing. The thoughts of a soul might be complex, but the soul itself would be a simple, unified thing. It doesn't have parts and whatnot. The theistic hypothesis says there is a soul. It's actually at the foundation of reality. this soul, because it's a person, because it's a mind, it has to have free will, has to have choice, has to have knowledge, and it will have power. Okay, those are the three things it needs. Even if it's just the power to think something, it can do something. And all you do is you add limitless to each one of those, and this is your foundation. And out of this foundation, you can explain why a contingent reality was chosen. Like, why is it exactly these laws, like these really interesting laws, and why are they just the laws that seem to give rise to, the possibility of life? You can come up with like an elegant model tracing back to the soul, the foundational mind hypothesis, which I find really attractive in my truth seeking.
Yeah, I mean, this conception of a soul as you're describing it is similar to the God that you're describing, which is, the least intellectually offensive version of a God I've ever heard. It's definitely the version of a God. It's definitely not the God of any of the major religions. It is simply, an entity without form, or without, you're not imposing anything upon it. So yeah, I mean, I would regard these two as the same thing. The way you're describing a soul and this deity that you're describing, I can see no evidence that they exist, and they have zero explanatory power for me. But I certainly cannot disprove them. I mean, they do not infringe anything upon the physical world that I live in that I would have counter evidence for. That I cannot reject it. So I mean,
real quick, I think, just to be super precise and careful, what we're doing is I'm trying to say, and it sounds like you're kind of okay with this, the prior probability of the God hypothesis, as long as he's not super complex like we were thinking, the prior probability isn't super duper low. Like, hey, maybe there is this foundational mind here that is super duper, it could not be more simple without failing to exist. But nevertheless, it does this explanatory work. Okay. And here's where I want to say you actually do have some evidence for the hypothesis. You could try to say this is also evidence for a competing hypothesis. Maybe there's some non-mind alternative, but the data that I'm presenting would be evidence for both. I would say, though, that the mind hypothesis should get at least a little bit of a leg up, actually probably a lot of a leg up, from the fine-tuning evidence, because there are so many. Again, it's different, all different kinds of initial conditions, all different kinds of values, constant values. So fine-tuning isn't going anywhere. That would fit. Wouldn't that be some evidence for the mind hypothesis, even if it's not proof?
But you're just attributing all of these. You're looking for these explanations of these parameters, and you're just attributing them to an entity instead of the universe itself. I don't see it as solving the problem. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no. Just to be actually, like, this is what I want to avoid, because I'm not making a God of the or a mind of the gaps argument. I'm very carefully using standard canonical Bayesian reasoning. Okay, I'm taking the mind hypothesis, the unbounded God / mind hypothesis, and I'm saying, look, if this hypothesis is true, the idea that a world would be produced with other minds, smaller minds, so to speak, coming out of it, is not wildly low. You can say it's low, but it's not wildly low. On the competing hypothesis that there is no such mind, we can look at the facts of fine-tuning and say the likelihood that a life-permitting universe would exist is insanely low. And this is all it takes to give a proof that we have evidence for the mind hypothesis, because the probability of a life-permitting universe on naturalism, say, is 0.000000000001, informed by the fact of fine-tuning. Whereas the likelihood...
We're just back on the very first point that we were discussing in this entire discussion.
You're right, but I'm coming back to...
You're introducing the concept of mind, the God's mind in us, to sort of tether the two, but I just look around and see a bunch of meat sacks. You know what I mean? I don't see any evidence for any kind of properties of mind that you're describing. And the whole argument presupposes the existence of the deity that you're trying to put evidence forward for. So I just
so you know what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say that evidence comes cheaply. First off, you can say this model or this hypothesis has evidence without granting that it's true. Okay. And originally, I thought we were under the sort of agreement that, hey, fine-tuning provides some evidence for God. It's just not enough evidence. And so when you said a second ago, there's no evidence for God, that made me want to say, hey, hold on, wait a second. Remember back to the first argument. It sounded like we agreed.
Well, I said it was a reasonable argument, but I think we elucidated perfectly viable explanations for fine-tuning. Namely multiverse.
Yeah, no, this will all come down to probability. Like, how likely is it that the multiverse is the case? You shouldn't be 100% sure that the multiverse is the case and explains the fine-tuning. If you're not,
I do not know that a multiverse exists.
Okay, cool, yeah. If you're not 100% sure, though, then that means that it doesn't dissolve the issue entirely. Okay.
I can say the same thing about any deity that you would describe and under any set of characteristics that you describe.
What do you mean?
Any doubt that you're casting on the existence of a multiverse can be cast upon any deity that you want to put forward.
I think that you can cast on the multiverse. I'm trying to relate that back to what I was saying.
I mean,
what do you?
I'm just offering. I'm just, I guess I lost my train of thought as well, but
just let me try to get us back to see where, because I don't know if that's fitting into what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is say, hey, we need to think like Bayesians right now. Okay, that means it's not a big deal to say that you have evidence for a hypothesis that you reject. Okay, you should, almost all philosophers, for example, who most of whom think in Bayesian terms, will say, yes, there's evidence for God and there's evidence against God. Question is how much, how strong is the evidence for each? So I wanted to kind of push back when you said, well, there's no evidence for God. I think like if I really got down in your brain, you don't really believe that, especially after our fine-tuning discussion. You should say there's some evidence for God, but it's not super strong because I haven't ruled out the multiverse hypothesis. Like, no, I'm not 100% confident in the multiverse hypothesis, but it's plausible enough that I don't feel big time teeth in the fine-tuning argument because the multiverse hypothesis is still there. And it's like,
there's a non-zero probability that a God exists. I can concede that. Yeah.
And there's some evidence for God, even though a multiverse is within the realm of possibility, because we're dealing with probabilities. We're dealing with gradation in evidence. You don't have to say it has the full force. What I would do, like if I were in your position, I would think to myself, okay, I think the multiverse hypothesis prevents this argument from being too strong. I feel like I've got an escape route, so to speak. But I still feel some of the force. Like, I get the point. Like, I feel a little bit of it. I get that, theists actually have a really clean explanation for the life permittingness of the universe. My explanation is kind of there, but it's not as comfy. It's a little bit, the fine-tuning of the universe is a little bit more surprising to me, at least, than it is to the theist.
It begs to be explained.
Yeah. But can you see it as at least a slight advantage to theism that theists are so comfortable with fine-tuning and the life?
Well, the explanation of fine-tuning, but as we were talking about before, I understand that theism comfortably explains fine-tuning. It then has the burden of explaining the existence of the deity. I mean, it's a tier of complexity, of greater complexity that now must be discussed, right? It's to me, that problem of adding another tier of reality outweighs the logical absurdity of a universe existing without cause.
Yeah.
To me, it's always going to come down to these two logical absurdities that are combating one another. They're both ridiculous, and you choose one. You know?
Yeah.
So.
Let me offer this and see if it makes sense to you. When the theist talks about God, which it's worth noting that the God hypothesis was already on the table. It's not like God was proposed to explain fine-tuning. There are many independent reasons for positing God before the fine-tuning. The fine-tuning is supposed to be a confirmatory type evidence. It's not a proof, it's confirmatory because it fits better on theism. Theists look at this and it's like, hey, this fits well with my model. It should be, an atheist should look at this data and say, okay, that makes a little bit more sense on theism. I'm a little bit surprised by that. Not enough to move me, but I get, cool. It's a bean in their pocket or whatever. That's a completely made up expression. So here's how you think of simplicity. Here's how I wanted to say, what you should do is you should look at this data and say, not just that the hypothesis is already there, but is this actually a complex hypothesis? Is the God hypothesis complex, like you say? Is the prior probability super low? I remember that I dispute that. And secondly, don't forget that that you too believe there is something that explains why the laws of physics are what they are and why they have the range of possibilities that they have. It's not God, but you do believe something is there. The question is just, I don't know what, but
I don't know if I do or not. I might. Yeah, it's hard to. Yeah, you're talking about that sort of fundamental necessitating existence.
Yeah. But then
I guess for me, what this hinges on is it's hard for me to tell whether your description of the deity that you're proposing as something that is very simple and not complex, although unlimited, whether that is ad hoc reasoning or I'm just not smart enough to get it. You know what I mean?
No,
because I'm getting lost in that region where you're describing. It's hard for me to understand how the deity that created a universe or many universes is simple. I cannot, and when we're talking about unlimited versus infinite, it's murky territory, and you know what I mean. There's a flavor of ad hoc, and there's the flavor of I don't get it. You know what I mean? It's a little bit of both in there. So,
I feel you.
But what I would like to say is that of all the gods that can be put forward, it's the most palatable to me. I obviously, as well, okay, whatever. I mean, I reject all the gods of the major religions, certainly, but a very generalized entity is a lot hard. Basically, what I'm saying is the God that you're describing, that you have just described, is the hardest for me to refute and is the most palatable to me, and is something, the gray area that I just described that hinges on ad hoc versus I'm confused is that's about, it's hard for me to say more than that.
Okay.
Yeah. Once again, to me, I'm just going to Occam's razor and I'm saying that the universe existing without cause is slightly less absurd than an entity that created the universe existing without cause. But anyone in their right mind is going to acknowledge that these are both very bizarre concepts to pit against each other. So
yeah. Well, so I actually, you keep saying, oh, well, maybe I'm not smart enough to get it. No, I think you're actually very quick, and I think you brought up some really good, like you have a good philosophy cap. You've been asking good questions. You've been thinking about it the right way. Even as someone who apparently hasn't invested any time researching it, you ask the right questions.
Yeah, I mean, I've read a little bit. I did a little bit of philosophy of science in college,
cool.
but not much.
Oh yeah,
but I haven't dived totally into all of these. I haven't gone too deep into epistemology or anything.
Okay.
But yeah.
Well, man, if you again, I don't know how much interest you have in this topic, but in academic, it's a weird name. It's called philosophy of religion. It's the branch of philosophy that is really focused on the debate about whether God exists or not. They're about like 50, 60 years ago, there was this fall of what's called verificationism, and it opened the doors again to people talking in philosophy about God. And there's been this renaissance of thought about the God question and the arguments for it. Like recently, there was a book. I went to a conference at Baylor, an amazing conference. Some of the leading thinkers on the issue came and presented like 24 different arguments for God's existence from different fields. And these are like academics who are very familiar with the back and forth over these debates. And they think, look, I think this argument holds. Actually, one of the people says, I don't know if it holds. Keller was saying that. But in other words, they presented all this evidence at the conference, and it ultimately got published into a book that came out recently, if you're interested, published by Oxford University Press. It's called 24 or So Arguments for God's Existence. Really neat, exciting stuff. Tons of peer-reviewed papers being published. In the area of philosophy, it's growing like crazy. If you're interested in the question, check out that book. Check out a guy named Richard Swinburne, who's a professor of philosophy at Oxford. He specializes and focuses on the question of whether God is simple. Turns out there's a lot of thought on the topic of simplicity. Like he has whole books that don't even mention God, that just talk about simplicity. Like, what is it? What does it look like? You might, some of the concepts might gel and persuade you, or not, maybe not.
It's an interesting concept. Yeah. Yeah, I fantasize about one day having the luxury to just become a pure scholar. I have to make enough money to outsource all of my workload onto others first. But hopefully, I'll be there in a couple of years. The channel is very demanding, but yeah, I mean, if I could choose, I would be somebody who just like reads and travels and talks and discusses all the time. And who doesn't have any work to do. So hopefully one day that will be the case. I don't know what you do.
Maybe you can add like some. Yeah. I mean, I was gonna say maybe Lee can even make some philosophy videos down the road if the.
Oh, I definitely will. Yeah, I definitely will. Yeah, when the time. Yeah, at some point. I'm trying to cover do more scientific disciplines first, but I will branch out to humanities and social sciences and things.
That's awesome. Well, I appreciate what you do. I, kind of like your video description said, a lot of videos are like they're educational, but you don't come out of it with real competence. Like, I mean, I guess you can't even come out with competence watching yours, but at least something a lot closer. So yeah. I think what you're doing is really great. And
cool, thanks.
And I appreciate, I appreciate you taking time to talk to me.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, this is more your territory. So yeah, thanks for humoring me. And yeah, no, that was definitely cool. I'm happy to. This is definitely interesting. So
yeah,
happy to talk more about it.
All right. Well, be careful what you say, because I love talking about it even more. Maybe I'll actually take you up on that. And it sounds like you have some interest in maybe like looking at like Christian particularism, because you were saying that, look, this sounds more plausible to me, but when you talk about like Christianity, man, I'm off the wagon there.
I mean, religion leaves a sour taste in my mouth. You know what I mean? And I'm smart enough to recognize that discussing a potential deity need not invoke religion as a concept. Right. This is a philosophical discussion. So I'm mature enough to recognize the difference there, which is why we didn't talk about religion at all. But yeah, religious fundamentalism really, really boils my blood. And
just so you know, I'm not an inerrantist. I accept, that the Earth is very old. The universe is very old.
Well, we've been discussing early universe cosmology this whole time, so I would be shocked if you were not scientifically minded. Yeah.
Yeah. if we were going to talk about that, I'd spend a lot of time focusing on the historical case for Jesus's resurrection. I think the case where it shocks people all the time. People who are like, how it was 2,000 years ago, it's a miracle, and like our main documents are written by people who were obviously Christians. Like, how are you, like, this is the most hopeless, there's no way. And those exact same people who say that, you'll see them coming out and saying, wow, actually you can make like a clean argument that really leaves you puzzled if you don't accept the resurrection, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if you accept the resurrection, first, if you accept God's existence, then miracles at least become possible. And then if you get, another layer of discussion about why God might plausibly send Jesus, why Jesus would actually be there talking about how people can be reconciled with God in this message. And then finally you say, hey, here's an actual reason why the actual case that God did vindicate Jesus. You can make a minimal case for Christianity that doesn't require you to accept biblical inerrancy or any of that stuff, but you can nevertheless get back to a lot of what Jesus taught and what the apostles taught. And you can get what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity, and it can be very intellectually viable and vibrant. So that'd be a fun conversation if it interests you one day.
It's certainly interesting. I'd have to do more research. This conversation required essentially no research, just because we're just thinking and talking. One I'd have to like read stuff and be prepared for what you're going to say. Maybe.
The alternative is I present it to you. That way you actually have it in mind, and then you can go look into it, and we can come back and chat again and whatever.
Yeah, for sure.
So. Anyways, man, I think did we hit the 2-hour mark? So that's I think what I'm gonna...
That's about how long people talk.
There you go. All right, brother. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me.
Thank you.
Probably make it happen again if you're game.
I'm into it.
All right, brother. Take care.
All right. See you, man.